Hi, it's Nahani Rouse. Welcome back to Can We Talk, the podcast of the Jewish Women's Archive, where gender, history, and Jewish culture meet. This spring, a series of violent attacks on Jews and Jewish-owned property in the United Kingdom has spurred British Prime Minister Keir Starmer to declare anti-Semitism a crisis in the UK. In April, 2 Jewish men were stabbed in London's largely Jewish neighborhood of Golders Green. There have been multiple arson or attempted arson attacks on synagogues, Jewish organizations, and businesses. In October 2025, a man killed 2 people at a Manchester synagogue during Yom Kippur. Meanwhile, anti-Semitic rhetoric has become more common in the public sphere, including among Green Party politicians who recently won victories in many local elections. For some perspective on all of this, we turn to Hadley Freeman, a UK-based columnist for the Sunday Times, who writes frequently about anti-Semitism, gender, and politics. Hadley's also the author of several books, including House of Glass, about her grandmother's family during World War II. She also happens to be my cousin by marriage. In this episode of Can We Talk, Hadley explains how writing her family's Holocaust story helped her understand the roots of anti-Semitism in Europe and anti-immigrant sentiment in the US. We also discuss what it's like to be Jewish and raising Jewish kids in the UK in this environment. You've written 2 recent articles about the increasingly common anti-Semitism and increasing incidents of anti-Semitic violence in the UK.
Yep.
So I want to talk to you both as a journalist and as a woman and a mother living in London. Let's start out with, what does it feel like for you right now as a Jew in London?
It definitely feels more, I don't want to say perilous, but you're definitely more heightened of danger. I've lived here for over 30 years now, incredibly, and there is just so much security around anything Jewish. The Jewish schools have so much security around them, the synagogues, of course. And I've been invited this weekend to the launch of Jewish Cultural Month, and they're not sending out the location or anything until like 12 hours before to reduce terrorism risks. And, that doesn't happen with any other minority group, and it just feels incredibly sad.
You wrote about your kids' performance being canceled because the venue was supposed to be at the synagogue that you attend with your kids regularly.
Exactly. So my youngest child's school, which is a non-religious school, was going to have their end-of-year concert at our local synagogue. And the school canceled it because they just said it's too risky, which just seemed extraordinary because the kids go to Hebrew school there every week, and I take them to synagogue there every Saturday, and it just was a real wake up to how everyone now sees this. It's not Jews being paranoid or whatever. Like, there is this sort of general awareness that this, it's dangerous to go to these places. And I have a lot of friends whose kids are having bar and bat mitzvahs this year, and they're having to put, on the invitations, just so you have to get here half an hour early to go through security, and we need to have everyone's names of who's coming, and you'll need to sign in and have the bag search and go through the metal detector. I just think it's really shocking, what's happened to the Jewish community in this country.
Do you feel unsafe for your kids and yourself on a daily basis?
The really sad thing is that the vast majority of these attacks are happening in Golders Green, which is this tiny little Jewish neighborhood, which is actually only a 10-minute drive away. But my kids aren't at school there, and the synagogue isn't there. So in a weird way, there's maybe this false sense of security. But certainly for my friends who live around there, and there's the Kosher Kingdom supermarket that we all go to buy our Jewish food. And that's where the 2 stabbings happened recently, was right in front of Kosher Kingdom. So you are aware there when you go to Golders Green. But for right now, I have to talk to the kids and explain things to them, but you don't want to scare them.
What have you observed in the aftermath of recent events like the stabbing in Golders Green? Like, what is the reaction in the society?
Well, for me, the biggest surprise is, first of all, how muted the reaction is. And there's a kind of yeah, but a lot of people, yeah, but if Israel wasn't doing this, there wouldn't be a problem. Or, yeah, but if Jews didn't support Israel, this wouldn't be a problem, which again is not something you hear about, I don't think, given regards to any other minority. If there was loads of Islamophobic attacks and Muslims are being stabbed in the street, I don't think anyone would say, yeah, but if Pakistan didn't behave like this, that wouldn't happen. And also an extraordinary amount of denialism from the left. So after this man traveled up from South London, which is quite a way away from Golders Green, to specifically go to Golders Green, a Jewish area, and stab 2 people. It later emerged he'd also, before he'd left his area, he'd stabbed his friend who was Muslim. And immediately, a lot of very vocal people on the left jumped on this and see, it's not about Jews. How dare you erase the Muslim victim? And to me, it really explained so much about Holocaust denialism, which I've seen a lot of increasingly in the past few years, especially from the left, who will say it wasn't really about the Jews. It was also about the Romani gypsies and handicapped people and gay people. That's who the Nazis were killing. You think, well, it's kind of focused on the Jews, wasn't it really? And October the 7th as well, a kind of obscuring of that to focus on what happened afterwards in Gaza. Just this refusal to accept that Jews aren't always oppressors, as they like to think. Jews are victims. It's been very eye-opening to see that.
So just to back up a little bit, a lot actually, you began your career writing about fashion. Mm-hmm. Did you ever expect to be writing so much about anti-Semitism?
Well, weirdly, no. Although I should sort of couch that by saying, before I even became a journalist, I knew I wanted to write about my grandmother, this story I've been obsessed with since I was a kid. And my grandmother immigrated to the States from Paris shortly before World War II. So that was always in the background. And then what happened to her brothers during the war, this family story that just completely haunted me since I was a child. So there was a part of me that always knew I wanted to write about that. But what I never expected was for Britain to feel so antagonistic to the Jews. And I naively didn't expect it from the left either. You kind of think of right-wing fascists and all that. I sort of missed, I guess, the week in school they taught about the communists and what they did to the Jews. So I'm surprised about it being in the present day. Me being obsessed with the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, that's less of a surprise to me.
So we will definitely talk more about your family history, but sticking with the current moment for a bit, when did you start feeling this anti-Semitism from the left in the UK?
Mm-hmm. This was really about 2014, 2015. The Labour Party, which is the left party in this country, elected the leader Jeremy Corbyn, who led the party for a good few years. And he had come from the very hard left tradition of the Labour Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, that kind of thing, and had, kind of allied himself with he's very anti-Israel and had said comments over the years about Zionists not really understanding English humor and, written prefaces for books that parroted very old anti-Semitic, anti-Israel theories. And then it was a huge anti-Semitism scandal in the Labour Party during that period, which was really 2014, I guess, to about 2020. And I was at The Guardian then, which is the liberal newspaper, and I was surprised how many of my colleagues who, are very, proudly anti-racist, couldn't see the anti-Semitism that was coming out of the Labour Party during then. So that was really the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And that's when you started writing about it.
Yeah, that's when I finally stopped dithering and I wrote my book, this book about my grandmother, which I'd been sort of procrastinating over for 20 years.
So this is House of Glass. You're saying that the awareness of the anti-Semitism on the left was connected to your finally writing this book about your family that you had always wanted to write?
Yes, totally. And also at the same time, it was obviously Donald Trump's first term in America, and his very anti-immigrant sort of poses and laws that he was bringing in also really spoke something to me about my grandmother, because obviously she'd been an immigrant who'd come from Paris in 1937 to the US. And so it was those two things. It was suddenly this anti-Jewish feeling I was seeing on the left and this very anti-immigrant, aggressive stance on the right in America. And those two things together made me want to write the book.
So, could you sort of summarize the story of what happened to your grandmother and her brothers during World War II?
So the book, which did finally come out in 2020, is about my grandmother and her three older brothers who were born in what is now Poland, emigrated after World War One when all the pogroms were starting to Paris, and were there, in my grandmother's case, until 1937, at which point she was tricked by one of her brothers into marrying a stranger in New York, who was my grandfather. And then the other three brothers stayed behind in Paris, and what happened to each of them. And so, I'm sure you've experienced this too, Nahani, as like a Jewish American growing up in the States. I was always brought up to think, the Jews who came to America from Europe during the war, they were the lucky ones. It was all freedom. It was great. And actually, my grandmother was really unhappy when she came to America and missed Paris and she had a fiance there and was very heartbroken and missed her brothers. But she did survive, whereas her brothers who stayed, one did die, but the other two had amazing lives. So already that story seemed interesting to me, but also is the fact that, I hadn't really understood how America didn't want a lot of the Jewish immigrants from Europe until I was researching this book. I really was so ignorant about how much they tried to keep them out for so long. And in fact, my grandmother couldn't get her brothers over, which is what she wanted to do and thought she could do by marrying this American. They couldn't get in. And also I hadn't understood how, it sounds stupid, but how anti-Semitic Europe was in the run-up to World War II. So on the one hand, I was seeing, I was so interested in that anti-Jewish feeling, how quickly it rose during the 30s in Europe, and also this anti-immigrant story in America, which I just didn't know about. And suddenly I was seeing those things in the modern day, and it made me feel like this book wasn't just me being self-indulgent and being another Jew who's obsessed with the Holocaust and over empathizing with my grandparents, but made it seem more relevant. So I wrote what my little sister still insists on calling my inevitable Holocaust book. And sisters are good for that kind of thing. So I did finally write this book, which I'd been carrying around inside of me for like 35 years and had been researching for 20 years.
Yeah, it's a wonderfully researched and beautifully written book.
Thank you.
How does having written this book and having delved so deeply into your family story influence the way you're looking at events playing out in the UK right now in terms of anti-Semitism?
Well, I think it's definitely given me a better awareness of history. I'm sort of amazed by how many people, about my age, I'm 47, or in my generation, really know nothing about history. And I didn't know anything about it till this book, so I don't know why I should be scornful of them. But it has given me a longer perspective and also an awareness of how quickly things can turn and how history can lead from one thing to the next to the next.
So you find yourself writing about anti-Semitism on the left a lot these days.
Yeah. The sort of racism is on the right at this point. In this country, anyway, in Britain, anti-Semitism has become more popular on the left, but also with sort of certain parts of sectarian Muslim political groups. It's also becoming an increasing problem who are gaining in power in this country.
What is the reaction that you've faced as a journalist, like writing largely in sort of left-wing progressive publications, I guess at first anyway? What kind of reaction have you faced from both colleagues and readers?
Well, the main reaction I faced was I eventually had to leave The Guardian, which was, I think, in 2022, which I never thought I would. I was there for 23 years, and I just thought it was my home. But the combination of writing about anti-Semitism and then also gender stuff just made it impossible. When I started there, it was very much about having a plurality of opinion. And increasingly, I feel on the left, maybe in America too, there's been a narrowing of opinion. There's the received orthodoxy, and then everyone who goes against it is a fascist or totalitarian or whatever. So the received orthodoxy on the left now is Israel is a fascist genocidal state. Palestinians are noble indigenous people. It was basically like a slave uprising, October the 7th. And anyone who disagrees with any of that, any small disagreement, is a fascist. I left and I went to the Sunday Times, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, which is, I would describe as a center-right paper. And it's a lot easier there.
Mm-hmm. And at the Times, so you don't feel that there's a sort of parallel conservative orthodoxy of thought?
Well, the Times is more center right, no question. But in terms of the subjects I write about, I at least have the freedom to write about those subjects. I feel honestly. When I arrived at The Guardian, what I loved about it, I arrived at The Guardian in 2000, and what I loved about it was there was a real plurality of views. I appreciate that some people who read The Guardian in the UK might laugh at that and think, oh, it's always been this kind of lefty rag. But actually, when I was there were writers there who were basically communists or identified as communists. And also, there were pro Iraq war hawks all writing columns in The Guardian at that time, as well as a lot of New Labour people and Tony Blair people and all that kind of stuff. So, yes, it definitely leaned left, but there was a definite range of views. And then in the past, I would say 10 years, that has changed. With the rise of social justice movements and sort of the far left progressive movement, you have to sign up for a certain range of opinion. You have a certain opinion on a range of subjects, whether it's gender identity and Israel, various environment things, what you think about sex work, what you think about surrogacy. You sort of tick all these boxes. They all become like this one giant omnicause of progressive politics. And The Guardian definitely went down that route where only certain views on each of those subjects felt acceptable, it seemed to me. And to the point that they took away my column.
You mentioned that when you left The Guardian, it was sort of over a combination of brushing off of anti-Semitism
Yeah.
and of not allowing a nuanced perspective on gender issues.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see a connection between those things?
I wouldn't have thought there was, but it turns out there really is. I mean, it's this weird thing where there has been this joining up of what one political writer in this country has called the rainbow and the crescent, which means the progressive LGBTQIA crowd and the very pro-Muslim crowd. And you wouldn't think these two groups would be able to get along because very sectarian Muslims are generally very pro-trans, pro-gay, and LGBTQIA aren't necessarily pro-sectarian Muslim, but they are united by a shared hatred of Israel. And the political group that has united them really in this country is called the Green Party, which used to be all about the environment, but is now just about these seemingly very disparate progressive causes. And we have this weird thing where the leader of that party is this man called Zach Polanski, who is a gay, anti-Zionist Jewish man who lives with another man, and his deputy is a very observant Muslim called Motin Ali, who cheered on October the 7th and whose wife wears a burqa. And it's just this completely mad alliance that I cannot believe will hold indefinitely, but is holding very strong right now.
Right, and the Green Party just had a victory in these
so we just had our
elections.
local elections here, and the main winner was really Reform, which is the hard right party. But what the Green Party did was it took away support from the Labour Party, which is the centre-left party, and as a result the Greens gained loads of seats and Reform gained a load of seats.
Can you talk about the Reform Party and their stance vis-a-vis anti-Semitism, or how anti-Semitism is kind of fitting into their positioning right now?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with the Reform Party is obviously there are anti-Semites in that party. It is a far right party, and in fact, Nigel Farage, who's the head of it, has been accused by multiple people who he went to school with here of being very anti-Semitic when he was at school. The Reform Party, though, its focus is way more on Muslim immigrants. So anti-Muslim prejudice is much more obvious in the Reform Party, as well as anti-Black prejudice. But, they are a far-right party, so obviously there is going to be anti-Semitism in it. I guess my feeling about it is that it's less of a surprise to me than it is from far-left parties, from the Green Party, like the Green Party, where the anti-Semitism has been really virulent. and actually far more pronounced than it has been in Reform.
Why do you think that's surprising?
Well, I think I was just naive. I didn't realize how prevalent anti-Semitism is on the far left, and also what's interesting about the Green Party here is it's become this umbrella party for both Muslim sectarian voters and progressive voters, and those two very disparate groups are united really solely by a shared loathing of Israel. So it's become like their dominant thing in a weird sort of way.
Can you talk about what it's like to raise Jewish children with liberal values in times like these?
Yes, so that is something I talk a lot about with the kids, because they sort of veer from, everything Israel's great, everything's great, which is something maybe they pick up from some of their friends, to why are we seeing all these starving Palestinian children on the covers of newspapers, Mom?
How do you respond to questions like that? I mean, you wrote a column about this very question.
Mm-hmm. What I said is there is a war going on. Israel, has made, will make decisions that we find upsetting. And just because we are Jewish and support the right of Israel to exist, believe in the original Zionist ideals, that doesn't mean we have to support everything Israel does. America, where my kids are American as well as British, has done terrible things in wars too. And we can look at them, talk about it critically, and also still support the American ideals. But what I also say to them is, look out for people who say Israel is worse than all the rest, who demonize Israel above all. Because in wars, both sides do terrible things. And I don't mean that to be both sidesism, but if someone is saying only Israel does bad stuff, then that is not someone to listen to.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it was 2 or 3 years ago, like about 8 months or something after October the 7th, my youngest, at her nursery, a little boy came up to her, and bear in mind, there are only 4 of these kids, and said to her and the 2 other Jewish kids in their class at nursery, you have to choose what team you support. And they were like, what? And he said, you have to choose, do you support Israel or Palestine? And my daughter said, I support Arsenal, which is her brother's favorite football team, because she didn't know what he was talking about. But it became this huge thing, and like the parents all had to come in. We all had to talk to the nursery teachers and everything. So that was quite shocking. And I think that is maybe a lot more common than people realize. And I'm not blaming this little 4-year-old boy. He was just parroting stuff he'd heard somewhere. My boys are in the 5th grade. And they're basically there's like 4 Jewish kids in a class of 55, at a year of 55, which is amazing, really. Whereas when I went to school in New York, it was like, half the class was Jewish. So I think there is a bit of, a sense of more of isolation of Jewish kids here who don't go to Jewish schools as mine don't. And I have thought about, would it have been easier if my kids were at Jewish school? But my friends who have kids at Jewish schools are just terrified because, there's so many threats. The kids have to go through so much security to get through the gates. People out, there have been lots of reports of people shouting at the kids through the gates, people taking photos of the kids. So it's a sort of lose scenario, although that sounds pretty gloomy. But what I try to do is emphasize the joy of Jewishness and explain to them that they will hear some things from some people, and they have heard some negative comments from some people. Yes, I do worry about the boys if they wear their yarmulkes out in public, when we're going to synagogue. But equally, I don't want to make them feel like they have to hide themselves. So it's just about looking around, being aware, and let's focus on the joy, which is our family, the holidays, your friends at synagogue, try to bring that into it. It helps that Paul McCartney sometimes comes to our synagogue, which is very exciting.
Oh, that's fun.
And the kids absolutely love the Beatles, of course. And Paul, of course, is married to a Jewish American, like all the best men. So that has sort of given them a surge of pride in Judaism because they think we have a Jewish Beatle.
Does he mingle when he's there?
Yeah, I don't want to be giving anything away here. He has now started going to the slightly cooler synagogue down the road. But he did, and he was so sweet afterwards. He'd be there, handing out the challah bread, happy to chat with everybody. Like you wouldn't think that people have been harassing him for, to talk to him for the, 2/3 of his life. He could not have been happier mixing with everybody. So that was fun. That helped. Thank you, Paul.
Well, Ned and I, when we both read your book, House of Glass, one of the things that we talked about was, wow, the generations before us lived such different lives.
Totally.
And our generation and our parents' generation probably have the most stable, safe, sort of boring, maybe by some accounts, existence of any Jews for many hundreds of years.
Totally.
Do you think that will be true for our children also?
I hope so. You can't help but look around and think, is this actually the 1920s? Like, are we seeing this slow accretion of historical events build towards some disaster blowing up in 2030, 2040, God forbid? I hope it's not like that. But we can only see. We can only wait and see.
Well,
that cheerful
this has been fun.
Hopefully not. Hopefully you think the education and everything else will form a break. But, I'm sure there's a Yiddish saying about let's just live in hope, shall we?
Hadley Freeman lives in London and is a columnist for the Sunday Times. She's the author of several books, including House of Glass, about her grandmother and her grandmother's brothers during the Holocaust. She's currently working on a biography of Nora Ephron, which includes a surprising twist about Sally from When Harry Met Sally that will be very intriguing for Can We Talk listeners. We look forward to having Hadley back to learn more. Thank you for joining us for Can We Talk, the podcast of the Jewish Women's Archive. Our team includes Jen Richler and Judith Rosenbaum. Our theme music is by Girls in Trouble. You can find Can We Talk online at jwa.org/canwetalk or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nahani Rouse. Until next time.